Teaching 1. The truth that sets you free, John 8 verse 32. Have you ever felt trapped by your own thoughts, as if your mind were a prison repeating fears, insecurities, and lies that make you doubt who you really are? It sometimes feels like, even when we try to ignore these voices, they gain strength. But what if I told you that all this can dissolve with just one word? Truth. Truth holds a power that lies can never possess. Jesus said, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." But what truth is this? It's not just information. It's a revelation, a key that opens doors that seemed locked for a long time. Imagine living without the burden of carrying these lies. Imagine waking up in the morning without that feeling of inadequacy, without the pressure to meet expectations imposed by society or even by yourself. Jesus speaks of a truth that goes beyond human understanding. He is not just offering you information, he is offering you freedom. When we connect with the truth of who he is and who he says we are, something within us changes. The lies that used to dominate lose their power because the light of truth exposes what was hidden. Think of the truth as a lighthouse in the middle of darkness. It's like that dense fog that prevents you from seeing the path ahead. Have you ever feared the future because you couldn't see it clearly? That is the effect of lies in our lives. They obscure our vision and make us believe the worst is always lurking. But truth illuminates. Truth reveals. And when light enters, fear has no more space. It disappears. Jesus is the truth itself, and it is by knowing him that we are freed from the prison of fear. How many times have you caught yourself believing that you were not good enough, that you didn't have what it takes to overcome a challenge? That's what the world tells you. That's what fear whispers in your ears. But Jesus' truth is different. He reminds us that we are more than conquerors, that we are children of God, loved, chosen, protected. When you know this truth, fear loses its strength. Have you ever seen a lie survive the light? When truth arrives, it dissipates the shadows of doubt and insecurity. Now look within yourself. What lies have you been carrying? What fears have been controlling your decisions? Is it the fear of not being enough, of failing, or of losing something or someone? Jesus teaches us that when we know the truth, we are set free. And this freedom is not temporary, it's permanent. But this requires a choice. You need to decide to abandon the lies. You need to decide that God's truth about you is more powerful than any fear that tries to dominate you. Teaching 2. Do not worry about tomorrow, Matthew 6 verse 34. Have you ever stopped to think about how much of your life you spend worrying about tomorrow? That nagging feeling that something bad might happen, or that you might not have control over what's coming. The fear of the future is a shadow that hangs over all of us at some point. What's curious is that we spend so much time anxious about what might happen that we forget to live in the now. Jesus, in his wisdom, warned us, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself." Each day has enough trouble of its own. But why, even after hearing these words, do we still let ourselves be consumed by anxiety? Anxiety is like a silent thief that slowly steals our peace, our joy, and our confidence. It feeds on uncertainties, on everything we can't control. But Jesus calls us to a different life. He calls us to trust in something greater than circumstances. Think about nature. Look at the birds in the sky or the flowers in the field. They don't worry about what they'll eat or wear tomorrow, yet God takes care of every detail. Are we, as God's beloved children, not much more valuable? Anxiety paralyzes us. It makes us believe we must have all the answers, that the future is in our hands. But this is an illusion. The control we think we have is just a desperate attempt to protect ourselves from the unknown. Jesus offers us a way out. He teaches us that we don't need to carry the weight of tomorrow because he is already there. He knows every detail, every difficulty, and every victory that the future holds. When we understand that we are not alone, that we have a God who has already prepared the way, the fear of tomorrow begins to fade. Now think about how many precious moments you've lost today because of fear about what might happen tomorrow. Maybe you were with your family, but your mind was caught up in financial worries. Or maybe you held back from taking an important step because you were afraid to fail. Anxiety stops us from living the present fully. But Jesus invites us to entrust tomorrow to him. He doesn't promise that tomorrow will always be easy, but he guarantees that he will be with us every step of the way. Take a deep breath. Let these words of Jesus sink into your heart. Do not worry about tomorrow. Each day has its own battles, but also its own victories. When we place our trust in God, we can rest in the certainty that He will take care of everything. Tomorrow belongs to Him, and our role is to live today with faith, knowing that no matter what happens, we will always be under His care. Teaching 3. Jesus walks on water, Matthew 14 verses 22 to 33. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where everything around you seemed to be falling apart, and fear whispered that there was no way out? Those moments when life's waves seem too high, too strong, and you feel like you're sinking? Peter knew this feeling all too well. In the middle of the storm, in the darkness of the night, he saw Jesus walking on the water. With courage, Peter asked to come to Jesus, and for a brief moment, he did the impossible. He walked on water. But then something happened. Peter took his eyes off Jesus and began to focus on the waves around him. Fear took over, and he started to sink. How many times do we do the same? We take the first step, confident that Jesus is with us, but soon we allow circumstances, problems, and life's storms to distract us. Fear is like those waves. It grows the more we focus on it. When we take our eyes off Jesus, we lose our balance, and what once seemed solid suddenly crumbles. Peter began to sink because he let fear become greater than his faith. But the story doesn't end there. When Peter began to sink, he did what all of us should do. He cried out for help, "Lord, save me!" And immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and lifted him up. This is the power of focusing on Jesus. Even when fear overwhelms us, Jesus doesn't let us sink. He doesn't abandon us in the storm. The problem isn't feeling fear. The problem is letting it pull us away from Jesus. When fear comes, and it will, the only thing we need to do is call out. Jesus is always ready to lift us up. Now think about the waters you are facing. What storms threaten to sink you? Maybe it's the fear of losing someone you love, the fear of failing at something important, or even the fear of the unknown. These waves can be intense, and the wind can be fierce. But remember, Jesus walks on water. He is not just someone who watches from a distance. He is the one who enters the storm with you, calling you to walk on top of the impossible. If you keep your eyes fixed on Him, the invitation from Jesus is clear. Come. He doesn't ask us to understand how everything will be resolved. He only asks us to trust and take the step. Peter sank when he let fear become greater than his faith, but Jesus was there to lift him up. The next time fear threatens to sink you, remember that Jesus is right beside you, ready to lift you up and help you walk on water again. The waves may be high, but there is nothing Jesus cannot cross for you. Teaching 4. Peace in the storm, Mark 4 verse 39. Have you ever wondered how it's possible to have peace amidst chaos? Life often feels like an uncontrollable storm, with winds threatening to destroy everything we've built and waves making us question if we can survive. In a boat with His disciples, Jesus showed us something profoundly impactful. Even in the midst of the greatest storm, He was at peace. Imagine that for a moment. While the disciples panicked, fighting against the wind and the water flooding the boat, Jesus was asleep. How could this be? The secret lies in His complete trust in God. When the disciples, terrified, finally woke Jesus up, crying out for help, His response was astonishing. He rose, looked at the fury of the elements, and simply said, "Peace, be still." Instantly, the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. What does this scene teach us? That the peace of Jesus doesn't depend on external circumstances. True peace is internal, rooted in the trust that God is in control, even when everything seems out of control. Think about the storms in your life. What keeps you up at night? What situations make you feel like the disciples in that boat, believing it's about to sink? It might be a financial crisis, a health issue, or a loss you can't seem to overcome. Whatever your storm, Jesus is with you in the boat. And just as He calmed the sea 2,000 years ago, He still has the power to calm the storms we face today. But more than calming the external, Jesus wants to calm what's inside of you. True peace isn't the absence of problems. It's the presence of Jesus. When we allow Him to enter the center of our storms, something changes. It's not that the problems disappear. It's that our perspective changes. We stop struggling with our own strength and start trusting in the one who has the power to calm even the strongest wind. The peace Jesus offers is a peace that defies logic, a peace that lets us rest amidst chaos, knowing we are safe in His hands. Now, look at your life and ask yourself, where do you need this peace? Are you trying to control the storms on your own, not realizing that Jesus is in the boat with you, ready to bring calm? Sometimes, all we need to do is what the disciples did, cry out for help. No matter how intense the storm may seem, Jesus is always within reach of your cry. He hears, He responds, and in His perfect time, He calms the storm. Vos dis. Numero 5. O ChatGPT dis. ChatGPT. Teaching 5. The Good Shepherd, John 10 verse 11. Have you ever felt lost, unsure of which direction to take? The world we live in, with its countless voices and opinions, often leaves us confused and questioning which path to follow. It's like being in a maze without a map, desperately searching for a way out. In this scenario, Jesus presents Himself as the Good Shepherd. He says, I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down His life for the sheep. This declaration is not just a promise of care, but a guarantee that even when we feel disoriented, He is ahead of us, guiding us. Think of a shepherd tending his flock. The sheep may not understand where they are going or see the dangers ahead, but the shepherd does. He knows the terrain, where the green pastures and still waters are. In the same way, Jesus leads us, even when we can't see what's ahead. Fear arises when we try to take control, believing we must understand everything. But the role of the sheep is to follow the shepherd, and our shepherd is good, faithful, and knows exactly what's best for us. How many times has the fear of the unknown paralyzed you? Have you ever found yourself in a dilemma, unsure of what decision to make, afraid of choosing the wrong path? The Good Shepherd not only knows the way but walks beside us. He goes before us, facing dangers, and protects us from behind, ensuring nothing harms us. Jesus doesn't promise there won't be dark valleys, but He guarantees that even in the valley of the shadow of death, He will be with us, guiding us with His rod and staff, protecting and comforting us. Now imagine this. You're walking down an unfamiliar road, feeling your anxiety increase with every step. But suddenly, you realize you're not alone. Beside you is the one who knows every curve, every obstacle, and who, with His attentive and loving gaze, guides you safely. This is Jesus, the Good Shepherd who never abandons His sheep, who carries us in His arms when we are tired and afraid. The Good Shepherd teaches us that fear of the future, fear of not knowing where to go, dissipates when we trust in His guidance. You don't need to have all the answers because Jesus already does. He knows the path you should take, and if you trust Him, He will lead you exactly where you need to be. Even if you're in the middle of a desert, unable to see a way out, remember, the Good Shepherd never abandons His sheep. He is with you, guiding, protecting, and leading you to the place of rest and provision He has prepared for you. Teaching 6. Faith as small as a mustard seed. Matthew 17 verse 20. Have you ever felt small in the face of life's challenges, as if your faith was so insignificant that it couldn't possibly overcome the mountains before you? Sometimes fear convinces us that our faith isn't enough, that it isn't big or strong enough to overcome the barriers we face. Jesus, with disarming simplicity, teaches us something extraordinary. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. A mustard seed is tiny, almost imperceptible, and yet Jesus uses this small seed as a powerful metaphor to show us that the size of our faith doesn't matter as much as its authenticity and focus. What Jesus is telling us is that even the smallest amount of genuine faith, if placed in Him, has the power to move mountains. These mountains could be anything: deep fears, insecurities, family problems, or professional challenges. What seemed insurmountable can suddenly become possible because it is not our strength that moves the mountain, but the faith we place in God. Often, we fall into the trap of believing we need a gigantic faith to overcome the obstacles in our path. But Jesus invites us to see faith differently. He challenges us to trust that, no matter how small our faith may seem, It carries a transformative potential when rooted in Him. A mustard seed, when planted, grows into a large tree, offering shade and shelter. Similarly, our faith, though small, can grow and become a source of strength and transformation in our lives and the lives of others. Think for a moment about the mountains you're facing. Perhaps it's the fear of failure, the fear of not being enough, or even the fear of not being able to overcome a loss. These mountains may seem unmovable, but Jesus reminds us that with faith, nothing is impossible. The beauty of this teaching is that it doesn't demand perfect faith from us. It simply asks for real, sincere faith, no matter how small. Faith that, like the mustard seed, may seem insignificant to human eyes but holds within it the power of God Himself. Now look within yourself. Perhaps you've been carrying the weight of thinking your faith isn't strong enough, that you need more to overcome your challenges. But Jesus challenges us to take the first step, even with the smallest amount of faith. He shows us that the size of our faith is not what determines the outcome, but rather the one in whom we place it. When we trust in Jesus, even the smallest seed can bear extraordinary fruit. The mountains may be tall, but faith, no matter how small, is more powerful than any obstacle. Teaching 7. The rejection of the world, John 15 verses 18 to 19. Have you ever felt the heavy weight of rejection? The silent pain that arises when you realize you don't fit in, that the people around you don't accept you, or treat you differently because of your faith. The fear of rejection is one of the most paralyzing fears we can experience. It keeps us from being authentic and often compels us to hide who we truly are to avoid discomfort and judgment. Jesus knew this would happen. He told us clearly, "If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first." These words may seem harsh, but they hold a liberating truth. What Jesus reveals is that rejection because of our faith is not unexpected or unusual. In fact, He prepares us for it. The world, with its values often opposed to those of God, will reject those who walk in the light of Christ. And this rejection can manifest in many ways, from cruel comments to exclusion from social circles, and even more severe forms of persecution. But there's a reason for this. Jesus says, "You do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world." We are not loved or valued by the world, but by God Himself. The world's opinion, no matter how painful, is not what defines us. Jesus endured the ultimate rejection, despised, ridiculed, and crucified. But through that rejection, He brought redemption to us. When the fear of rejection haunts us, we should remember that we are in good company. The Savior of the world was rejected too, and He calls us to follow Him, even if that means facing rejection as well. But what if, instead of fearing rejection, we viewed it as confirmation that we are on the right path? When we are rejected for following Christ, it is a sign that we are living according to kingdom values rather than the world's standards. Rejection may hurt, but it can also strengthen us. It reminds us that our identity is rooted in something far greater than the fleeting approval of this world. Our true acceptance comes from God, and in Him, we find our security. Think about the times you felt rejected, maybe in a group of friends, at work, or even within your own family. These experiences might have fostered fear or even the desire to conform, to fit in at any cost. But Jesus calls you to something greater. He reminds you that while the world may reject you, He has chosen you, and His choice is eternal, firm, and unshakable. When the fear of rejection arises, remember that you are accepted by the Creator Himself, and that acceptance is all that truly matters. Teaching 8. The power of humility, Matthew 5 verse 5. Have you ever found yourself trying to appear strong and in control, even when deep inside you felt small and vulnerable? The world teaches us to value those who seem invincible, self-reliant, and never show weakness. But Jesus turns this logic upside down. He tells us something profound and counterintuitive. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. For many, this may seem like a contradiction. How can meekness, often associated with weakness, lead to something as grand as inheriting the earth? The secret lies in what Jesus truly means by meekness and humility. It's not about passivity or letting others walk over you. It's about an inner strength expressed through calmness, confidence, and self-control. Humility is the ability to recognize our limitations and accept that we don't have all the answers and, yes, that we need help. And that help comes from God. Fear often arises from our pride, the false belief that we must be the heroes of our own stories and solve everything on our own. But Jesus invites us to rest in humility, to trust that God is in control. Think of a shepherd caring for his sheep. The sheep don't try to be bigger or stronger than they are. They trust the shepherd. This is the essence of the humility Jesus teaches us. When we are humble, we acknowledge that we don't need to carry the weight of the world alone. We can trust in God, our good shepherd, to guide and protect us. And this trust is what frees us from fear. Pride isolates us. It makes us feel like we're alone in our battles. But humility creates space for God to step in and fight for us. Now, take a moment to reflect. How many times has the fear of appearing weak stopped you from asking for help? How often has pride made you carry burdens that weren't yours to bear? The power of humility lies in letting go of that burden, in recognizing that by placing ourselves in God's hands, we find true strength. Being humble doesn't mean being passive. It means choosing to trust in God's power instead of relying solely on our own strength. It's understanding that in our weakness, He becomes our strength. Humility allows us to inherit the earth because it positions us in total dependence on God. And when we are dependent on Him, no fear can dominate us. He cares for us, lifts us up, and strengthens us. True greatness is not in exalting ourselves, but in humbling ourselves before God, knowing that He takes care of every detail of our lives. When we shed our pride and embrace humility, we find a peace that the world cannot offer. A peace that comes from knowing we don't have to be the heroes of our own stories because God already is. Teaching 9. The parable of the prodigal son, Luke 15 verses 11 to 32. Have you ever feared not being accepted back, that perhaps your mistakes were too great for anyone to forgive? The fear of rejection often stops us from seeking reconciliation, making us believe that we don't deserve a second chance. The parable of the prodigal son speaks directly to this fear, revealing something profound about God's heart and His readiness to welcome us back, no matter our mistakes. In the story, the younger son decides to leave home, taking his share of the inheritance and squandering it in a reckless lifestyle. When everything is gone, he finds himself at rock bottom, alone and destitute. It is at this low point that fear begins to dominate him. Fear of not being accepted, fear of having burned all bridges. He thinks of his father, and the weight of shame overwhelms him. Nevertheless, he decides to return home. But even on his way back, what is his expectation? He plans to ask to be a servant, believing that his mistakes have stripped him of the right to be a son. This is the trap fear lays for us. It makes us believe we are unworthy, that love and forgiveness are beyond our reach. But what happens when the son returns? Before he even reaches the door, the father sees him from a distance and runs to meet him. He doesn't demand explanations or ask questions. He simply embraces him. The father's actions shatter all the son's expectations and the lies fear had planted in his mind. The father's love is greater than any mistake. How many times do we let fear stop us from returning to the Father's arms? How often do we believe our errors are too great to be forgiven? The prodigal son teaches us that God's love has no limits. He is not waiting for our perfection, but for our return. And the moment we turn back to Him, He runs to meet us. Think about the areas of your life where you've been carrying guilt and shame. Maybe you've been avoiding returning to God out of fear of rejection or believing your failures are too big. But the truth is, God does not reject you. He waits with open arms, ready to restore and embrace you as His child. God's love is a love that runs toward you, breaking through the barriers of fear and guilt. The story of the prodigal son reminds us that it's never too late to return, that we are never too far from the reach of God's love. He doesn't see us through eyes of criticism, but with eyes of compassion. When we overcome fear and take the first step back, we find that God is already running to embrace us. Teaching 10. Do not fear, only believe. Mark 5 verse 36. Have you ever faced a situation so challenging that it seemed there was no way out? Those moments when fear takes over and you feel the worst is already sealed, that there is nothing left to do. Your heart races, doubts rise, and all that remains is the dread of losing what you hold most dear. This was the exact scenario where Jesus spoke one of the most powerful phrases ever uttered. Do not fear, only believe. These words were addressed to Jairus, a desperate father who had watched his daughter fall gravely ill. He sought Jesus with faith, believing he could heal her. But on the way, terrible news came. His daughter had already died. The fear Jairus must have felt at that moment is something we've all experienced to some degree. The fear that it's too late, that hope is gone, and despair becomes suffocating. But Jesus, with his divine calmness, looked at Jairus and said, Do not fear, only believe. It's a declaration that defies logic, that challenges what seems like an inevitable ending. Jairus' daughter was dead, but Jesus was telling him not to fear. How is this possible? What Jesus was doing was inviting Jairus, and all of us, to look beyond the circumstances, to see with the eyes of faith. Jesus was teaching that even in the darkest moments, faith can bring light and hope. He wasn't asking Jairus to ignore reality, but to believe that, with him, reality could be transformed. When Jesus arrived at Jairus' house, he found people weeping and lamenting, already resigned to what had happened. But Jesus once again confronted fear with a greater truth. He entered the girl's room, took her by the hand, and said, Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And the impossible became possible. The girl got up and lived. What seemed like the end was transformed into a new beginning because Jesus was there. Faith in Jesus is not blind faith, but faith in a God who has power over life and death, over the deepest fears we carry. Now reflect on the areas of your life where fear has spoken louder. Perhaps it's the fear of losing someone, the fear of failure, or the fear of facing something too difficult to bear. Jesus tells you the same thing he told Jairus. Do not fear, only believe. When we place our faith in him, despair loses its grip on our hearts. Jesus invites us to believe, not because circumstances always change instantly, but because he is greater than any circumstance. Fear tells us we are alone, that nothing more can be done. But faith reminds us that Jesus is always present, ready to act. And when he is present, the impossible becomes possible. Even when all seems lost, he calls us to not fear but to believe. These two words are the key to overcoming the fear that paralyzes us and clinging to the hope Jesus offers. Teaching 11. The rejection of the world, John 15 verses 18 to 19. Have you ever felt the weight of being rejected? That silent pain that arises when you realize you don't fit in, that the people around you don't accept you or treat you differently because of your faith. The fear of rejection is one of the most paralyzing fears. It prevents us from being authentic, makes us hide who we truly are to avoid discomfort or judgment. Jesus knew this would happen. He told us plainly, If the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. These words might seem harsh, but within them lies a liberating truth. What Jesus reveals is that rejection because of our faith is not unexpected or unusual. In fact, he prepares us for it. The world, with its values often opposed to God, will reject those who walk in the light of Christ. This rejection can come in many forms, from hurtful comments to social exclusion and even more severe persecution. There's a reason for this. Jesus explains that we are not of this world. We have been chosen by him, called to live in a different way. And it is precisely this difference that provokes rejection. But here's the key. The world's rejection does not define our worth. We are not loved or valued by the world, but by God himself. The opinion of those around us, no matter how painful, does not determine who we are. Jesus endured the greatest rejection of all, being despised, mocked, and crucified. But through that rejection, he brought us redemption. When the fear of rejection haunts us, we must remember that we are in good company. The Savior of the world was rejected, and he calls us to follow him even if it means facing rejection too. And what if, instead of fearing rejection, we saw it as confirmation that we are on the right path? When we are rejected for following Christ, it's a sign that we are living according to the values of his kingdom, not the world's. Rejection can hurt, but it can also strengthen us. It reminds us that our identity is rooted in something far greater than temporary acceptance from the world. Our true acceptance comes from God, and in him, we find our security. Think about the times you felt rejected. It might have been in a group of friends, at work, or even within your own family. These experiences might have created fear or even the desire to conform at all costs. But Jesus calls you to something greater. He reminds you that while the world may reject you, He has chosen you. And that choice is eternal, firm, and unshakable. When the fear of rejection arises, remember that you are accepted by the Creator Himself, and that acceptance is all that truly matters. Teaching 12. Sheep among wolves. Matthew 10 verse 16. Have you ever felt vulnerable, as if you were navigating a world full of dangers, surrounded by people or situations that seem to threaten your faith and your safety? The fear of being harmed, misunderstood, or even persecuted for following Christ can be a constant shadow in our lives. Jesus, understanding this reality, gives us a powerful warning. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. This statement is both a caution and a strategy. Jesus does not promise us an easy path or that the world will always welcome us with open arms. He is realistic about the threats we will face, comparing us to defenseless sheep surrounded by wolves, natural predators. However, He shows us that even in such a dangerous scenario, we should not succumb to fear. He calls us to act with wisdom and cunning without losing the purity and simplicity of our hearts. Being a sheep among wolves means acknowledging our vulnerability but also trusting in the protection of the shepherd. Jesus does not send us into the world without guidance. He instructs us to be as wise as serpents. This does not mean being deceitful or manipulative, but having discernment, being aware of the times, people, and environments around us. Discernment is essential to navigate a world that often tries to pull us away from God. At the same time, He asks us to be as innocent as doves. The dove is a symbol of peace and purity. Jesus does not want us to become hardened or cynical because of the challenges we face. Instead, He calls us to maintain pure hearts, to act with honesty, kindness, and integrity, even when surrounded by opposition. This is a delicate balance, to be wise and prudent while remaining pure and peaceful. It is the path Jesus shows us to confront the fear of living as Christians in a world that often rejects us. Have you ever faced situations where you had to choose between being shrewd or being kind, unsure of how to balance the two? Perhaps at work, in personal relationships, or in situations where your faith was tested. Jesus teaches us that we do not have to choose between wisdom and simplicity. We can have both, and both are powerful weapons against fear. Prudence protects us from falling into traps, while simplicity keeps us connected to the love of Christ. The fear of being a sheep among wolves is real, but so is the promise that with the wisdom and peace that come from God, we can navigate this world without losing who we are in Christ. When fear arises, remember that Jesus does not ask us to fight with the weapons of this world, but with the wisdom of serpents and the purity of doves. In this way, we can live among wolves without being devoured by fear, knowing that our shepherd is always with us, protecting and guiding us. Teaching 13. The Widow's Offering, Luke 21 verses 1-4. Have you ever felt small, as if what you have to offer is insignificant? We live in a world that values abundance, grandeur, and excess, often leading us to believe that if we cannot give much, it is not worth giving anything at all. The fear of inadequacy, whether financial, emotional, or spiritual, can paralyze us. However, Jesus, while observing a poor widow offering 2 small coins at the temple, taught us something that completely reverses this logic. He showed that the value of what we offer does not lie in the amount, but in the intention and sacrifice behind it. This widow, without fanfare, placed in the offering box everything she had to live on, 2 small coins. In the eyes of the world, what she gave seemed insignificant, almost nothing. Many around her were offering large sums, contributions that, compared to hers, seemed far more valuable. Yet, Jesus saw her heart behind the act. He was not impressed by the large sums, but by the depth of her sacrifice. He said to his disciples, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all these people gave out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." What does this story teach us about the fear of inadequacy? First, It shows us that God does not measure as the world measures. He is not impressed by grand external displays, but values what comes from the heart. The fear of inadequacy is dispelled when we understand that God sees our effort, sincerity, and desire to give our best. No matter how small it seems to others, He knows when we give sacrificially, and to Him, that small gift is immense. Now, think about your own life. How many times have you held back from acting or offering something out of fear that it was not enough? Perhaps it was a word of encouragement you didn't say, help you didn't offer, or even a project you didn't start because you thought it wouldn't have an impact. The widow's offering teaches us that even the smallest act, when given to God, becomes much. What seems insignificant in our hands gains immeasurable value when surrendered with faith and humility. When you give what you have, even if it is little, God multiplies it. This is the power of an offering given from the heart. The fear of being insufficient loses its grip when we understand that, in God's hands, any act of faith and generosity is transformed. The important thing is not how much we give, but the quality of our giving. When we overcome the fear of inadequacy, we discover that God can use even the smallest offerings to accomplish great things. So, the next time the fear of not being enough tries to paralyze you, remember the widow. Jesus not only saw her offering but honored it. He does the same for us when we give without fear that it will be too little. Because with God, the small becomes extraordinary. Teaching 14. Forgiveness that frees. Matthew 18 verses 21 to 22. Have you ever held onto a grudge so deep that forgiveness felt impossible? The fear of forgiving is real. Fear of being hurt again. Fear that by forgiving, we might let injustice win. Forgiveness can seem like a weakness, as if we are relinquishing our own protection. But Jesus, in one of His most challenging teachings, shows us that true power lies in forgiveness. When Peter asked how many times he should forgive his brother, expecting a reasonable number, Jesus replied, up to 70 times 7. This response goes beyond mathematics. Jesus is not suggesting a limit. He is pointing to the boundless nature of forgiveness. What Jesus is teaching us is that forgiveness is not just a one-time act, but a way of life. Why? Because forgiveness sets us free, not just the person being forgiven, but especially the one who forgives. Forgiveness is not a gift to the offender. It is liberation for the offended. When we hold on to resentment, we are imprisoning ourselves emotionally, carrying a weight we were not designed to bear. The fear of forgiving often stems from the belief that by doing so, we make ourselves vulnerable. But Jesus shows us that forgiveness does not mean justifying the pain inflicted on us. On the contrary, forgiveness is a decision to release the control that the offense holds over our lives. Jesus calls us to forgive not because the other person deserves it, but because we deserve the peace that forgiveness brings. It is a powerful decision that breaks the chains of bitterness and dissolves the fear of being prisoners to our own resentment. Now, think about someone you need to forgive. Perhaps it is someone close to you, a friend, a family member, or even someone you have distanced yourself from. The fear of forgiveness might tell you that if you forgive, the pain will go unrecognized, or the offender will get away with what they did. But the truth is that forgiveness is not about the other person. It is about you. It is about finding freedom in Christ, the same freedom He gave us by forgiving our own faults. Jesus, in His greatest expression of love, forgave us even when we did not deserve it, and He calls us to do the same. The act of forgiving is a step of faith, believing that by releasing the offense, God will take care of our pain. Moreover, He will heal the wounds that bitterness has kept open for so long. The fear of forgiveness fades when we understand that we are not alone in this process. Jesus empowers us to forgive, and He walks with us as we take this difficult step. Forgiveness is the key that unlocks the door to the peace we so desperately seek. So, the next time the fear of forgiving arises, remember that forgiveness is not a weakness, but one of the greatest acts of strength we can perform. It is choosing freedom over imprisonment, peace over pain. When we forgive, we are not only obeying Jesus' command, but also setting ourselves free to live the full life He has promised us. Teaching 15. The importance of loving your neighbor. Matthew 22 verse 39. Have you ever kept your distance from someone out of fear of being hurt? The fear of love is subtle but real. It builds walls around us, keeping others at arm's length and sometimes isolating us completely. Yet, in his most fundamental teaching, Jesus calls us to tear down these walls. Love your neighbor as yourself. Loving your neighbor is not a suggestion or an option. It is a commandment. But what happens when fear keeps us from opening our hearts? Fear of betrayal, fear of misunderstanding, or even fear that our love will not be reciprocated. Jesus knew that true love involves vulnerability. To love your neighbor as yourself means being willing to risk being hurt. But this risk is essential because love is the only force capable of transforming hearts, uniting what is broken, and bringing healing to wounded lives. When we let fear dominate, we build walls that not only shield us from pain, but also rob us of the joy and connection that love provides. Jesus calls us to love without reservations, without measuring how much the other person deserves it or how much we are willing to risk. The truth is, the fear of love is a trap. It makes us believe that by protecting our hearts, we are gaining something. But in reality, we are losing the essence of what it means to live in communion with others. Loving your neighbor doesn't just mean acts of kindness or superficial gestures. It means seeing others with the same value God sees in them. It is a daily choice to open your heart, even when it feels difficult. Fear tries to convince us to be cautious, but Jesus teaches that love is more powerful than any risk involved. Now, reflect on the people around you. Is there someone you are afraid to approach? Someone you have avoided loving fully out of fear of rejection or being hurt? Jesus' call is clear. Love your neighbor. Love without fear. Fear paralyzes us, but love sets us free. Love is not something we give expecting something in return. It is something we offer because we understand that God loved us first. It is God's love that envelopes and transforms us, enabling us to love others even in the most challenging circumstances. When we love our neighbor, we reflect God's own heart. Fear might make us hesitate, but love compels us to act. Just as Jesus loves us unconditionally, he calls us to do the same. Even though the world tells us to protect our hearts at all costs, Jesus teaches that it is in loving without reservations that we find true freedom and peace. Loving your neighbor is about overcoming the fear of being hurt and choosing to live in the fullness of the purpose God has for us. Teaching 16. The encounter with the blind man of Jericho, Mark 10 verses 46 to 52. Have you ever felt ignored, as if your voice didn't matter, no matter how much you cried out for help? Bartimaeus, the blind man of Jericho, knew this feeling all too well. He lived on the margins of society, invisible to many, carrying the weight of rejection and despair. Yet, what set Bartimaeus apart was his courage to cry out despite the noise of the crowd trying to silence him. Fear could have kept him quiet, but his faith pushed him to shout even louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." How many times has fear silenced us? Fear of exposing our needs, fear of rejection, or fear of not being heard. Bartimaeus teaches us a powerful lesson. Even when the world tries to silence us, we must not let fear outweigh our faith. Bartimaeus was sitting by the roadside, with little hope of changing his physical and social condition, until he heard that Jesus was passing by. In that moment, something within him stirred. He knew this was his chance to change his life, and he would not let it pass him by. When Bartimaeus began to cry out to Jesus, many around him rebuked him, telling him to be quiet. This is often the point where many of us give up. The fear of rejection, mockery, or failure makes us retreat. But Bartimaeus did the opposite. He shouted even louder, defying fear and the voices opposing him. He knew that Jesus was the only solution to his situation, and nothing else mattered. His determination was stronger than his fear. And Jesus, amidst the noise of the crowd, stopped. In the midst of all the commotion, he heard the cry of Bartimaeus. This teaches us something profound. No matter how small or insignificant we feel, Jesus always hears our cry. Fear tells us that our voice won't be heard, that our prayers are futile. But Jesus proves otherwise. He called Bartimaeus and asked, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus responded with simplicity and faith, "Rabbi, I want to see." Moved by his faith, Jesus restored his sight. "Go, your faith has healed you." Now think about the areas in your life where fear has silenced you. Maybe it's a prayer left unsaid, a dream you've been too afraid to pursue, or a cry for help you've hesitated to express. Jesus is passing by, just as he did for Bartimaeus, and he is ready to hear your cry. What is holding you back from calling out to him? Is it fear of rejection or fear of failure? Bartimaeus shows us that faith, when placed in Jesus, is stronger than any fear. His encounter with Jesus is a powerful reminder that fear does not have the final say. Jesus invites us to cry out, to seek him boldly, without fear of being ignored or rejected. If Bartimaeus had remained silent, he would have stayed on the margins of life. But his faith caused him to cry out, and that cry changed his destiny. What is stopping you from crying out today? Jesus is passing by, and he is ready to stop and hear your voice. Teaching 17. The Power of the Beatitudes, Matthew 5 verses 1 to 12. Have you ever wondered how it's possible to find happiness in the midst of pain? The world teaches us that happiness is tied to the absence of problems, the achievement of success, and material comfort. However, when Jesus ascended the mountain and shared the Beatitudes, he presented a truth that completely challenges this logic. He revealed that true happiness, or blessedness, is not found in external circumstances, but in the state of our hearts before God. Jesus begins by saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit means to recognize our total dependence on God. In a world that values self-sufficiency and personal strength, Jesus teaches that true happiness begins when we abandon pride and admit that, without God, we are incomplete. This is liberating because it frees us from the burden of trying to be strong all the time. Instead of being consumed by the fear of failure, we are invited to lean on God's grace and strength. He continues, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." This is one of Christ's most beautiful promises. He doesn't promise a life without pain, but he guarantees comfort for those who suffer. The fear of pain often prevents us from living fully, as we constantly try to avoid suffering. But Jesus teaches that mourning is not the end. It is the beginning of divine comfort. God's comfort not only heals our wounds, but transforms us, giving us a renewed vision of life and purpose. Then Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled." How often does the fear of injustice paralyze us? We live in a world where the righteous often seem to be mistreated, and the thirst for justice is frequently frustrated by the reality around us. But Jesus gives us hope that God's justice is greater than any earthly injustice. He calls us to continue seeking what is right, trusting that, in his time, he will bring about true justice. This is an invitation to let go of the fear of worldly injustice because God is the righteous judge, and we can trust him. The power of the Beatitudes lies in teaching us that fear of circumstances, pain, or injustice should not define our lives. True blessedness or happiness does not come from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that God is with us in every situation. Jesus shows us that the meek will inherit the earth, the merciful will receive mercy, and the peacemakers will be called children of God. These are values the world does not understand, but that have a transformative power in our lives. Now, reflect. What has been holding you back from living this blessed life? Perhaps it's the fear of suffering, the fear of appearing weak, or even the fear of being treated unfairly. But Jesus teaches us that true happiness is beyond what the world offers. When we live according to the principles of his kingdom, we find a peace and joy that surpasses any adversity. The Beatitudes remind us that, in Christ, there is a hidden blessing in every challenge, a joy the world cannot comprehend but that is real and accessible to all who follow Jesus' way. Teaching 18. Treasure in Heaven, Matthew 6 verses 19 to 21. Have you ever been consumed by the fear of losing what you possess, whether material belongings, a position, or even a relationship? The fear of loss is one of the greatest sources of anxiety in life. We are constantly surrounded by messages that tell us our value lies in what we accumulate, that our security depends on how much we have. But Jesus presents us with a completely opposite truth. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The fear of losing what we have is directly tied to the false sense of control we think we hold. When our lives revolve around the accumulation of material goods, status, or earthly accomplishments, we live in constant worry, afraid that something or someone will take away what we've built. This fear breeds insecurity, anxiety, and a relentless need to maintain control. But Jesus teaches us that true treasure is not what can be lost or stolen, but what is eternal and incorruptible, treasures in heaven. Storing up treasures in heaven means living a life focused on what truly matters: love, compassion, generosity, and a deep relationship with God. These are treasures that no one can take from us. When we place our security in heavenly things, the fear of losing earthly things begins to lose its power over us, because what truly holds value, our relationship with God and the life we live for His kingdom, is safe in Him. Now consider, where is your heart? The fear of loss often prevents us from living fully. We become trapped in a ceaseless pursuit of more money, more recognition, more security, believing that these will bring us peace. But Jesus teaches that true peace is not found in what we accumulate here on earth, but in what we build for heaven. The most remarkable truth is that as we seek heavenly treasures, we find a freedom that the world cannot offer. We are no longer bound by the fear of loss, because we know that our real treasure is secure. Jesus ends this teaching with a statement that cuts to the heart. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What have you been considering your greatest treasure? If your heart is tied to earthly things, you will live in fear of losing them. But if your heart is set on things above, there is no room for fear, because you know that nothing can separate you from God's love and the eternal promises He has for you. The next time fear of loss consumes you, remember this teaching of Jesus. He calls us to focus on the eternal, to invest our time and energy in what truly matters and can never be destroyed. When we live this way, the fear of loss is replaced by a deep trust in God, and we discover a peace that doesn't depend on circumstances or possessions. Teaching 19. The mission to make disciples, Matthew 28 verses 19 to 20. Have you ever felt afraid of not being able to fulfill your purpose? The fear of failure or of not being adequately prepared for the task God has set before you can be overwhelming. In His final words before ascending to heaven, Jesus gave us a clear mission. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely, I am with you always, to the very end of the age. This calling is so great that, for many of us, it might seem daunting. How can we make disciples? How can we share the message of Christ with the world when we are so aware of our own flaws and limitations? The fear of failure looms over us, holding us back, and we might feel inadequate, thinking we don't have the right words or the wisdom to truly impact someone's life. But what Jesus teaches here is that this mission does not depend on our perfection or capability. It depends on Him. He promises that He will be with us every single day, in every step of this journey. With this assurance, fear begins to lose its grip. We are not alone, and we are not operating on our own strength. Making disciples isn't about having all the answers or being the perfect example. It's about sharing what we have already received from God: love, grace, and a transformed life in Christ. Jesus calls us to live authentically, to teach others through our own journey of faith, and to trust that He equips those He calls. The fear of inadequacy dissipates when we understand that it is not about us. It's about Christ in us. He is the true teacher, and we are His instruments. When He says, "Go," He also guarantees that He will go with us, guiding our steps and providing the words we need at the right time. Now, reflect on the impact your life can have. It might feel intimidating to think about making disciples and sharing your faith, especially in a world that often rejects the truths of the gospel. But Jesus does not call us to be successful by the world's standards. He calls us to be faithful. The success of this mission isn't measured by our abilities or the visible results, but by our willingness to obey. When we let go of the fear of failure and step out in faith, trusting that He is with us, God uses our lives in ways we could never imagine. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live without the fear of failing in your mission? Jesus calls us to place our complete trust in his presence and power, and that means the fear of inadequacy no longer has to hold us back. He is present, walking alongside us, and he is the one who does the work. Our role is simple: to go, to teach, and to live according to his commands, leaving the results to him. When we embrace this mission, the fear of failure loses its power because, in the end, it's not about our ability but about Jesus' faithfulness. The mission to make disciples is great, but the promise that accompanies it is even greater. And surely, I am with you always, to the very end of the age. This assurance propels us forward, giving us the courage to go, to teach, and to make disciples, confident that with Jesus by our side, there is no room for fear, only faith and obedience. Teaching 20. Overcoming fear through prayer, Matthew 6 verse 6. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where fear seemed to be the only sound in your mind? Moments when the dread of the future or the weight of the present suffocates all hope? When fear takes hold, it can be an overwhelming presence. But Jesus offers us a powerful weapon against it: prayer. In Matthew 6 verse 6, Jesus teaches us about the importance of an intimate and private relationship with God. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Prayer, in this sense, is not merely a formality or a ritual. It is an intimate conversation with God, a sacred space where we can open our hearts and expose our deepest fears. Jesus invites us to enter our room, a place of privacy and intimacy, and to speak directly to the Father. This is where fear loses its power because we are in communion with the one who controls all things. When we pray in secret, it's as though we are stepping into a safe haven where the voices of fear are silenced by the gentle voice of God. Think about how often you've tried to face fear alone, believing that the solution would come from your own strength or intellect. Fear convinces us that we are alone and that we must bear the weight of our worries ourselves. But prayer reminds us that we are never alone. When we close the door and speak to God, we connect with the Creator of the universe, the one who knows every detail of our lives and has power over every situation. This is the key to overcoming fear, knowing that God is with us and that He hears our prayers. The most profound part of this teaching is the assurance that God sees in secret. He sees the fears you don't share with anyone, the tears you shed in silence, and the prayers you whisper when no one else is around. The Father, who sees what is done in secret, acts on our behalf in ways we may not immediately perceive. Fear tells us that God isn't listening or that He is distant, but Jesus assures us that every prayer is heard and every cry is seen. Now reflect on the last time you sought God in prayer. Was it a desperate plea or an intimate conversation? Fear loses its grip when we bring our concerns before God. He doesn't promise that all problems will disappear instantly, but He gives us a peace that surpasses all understanding. Prayer is an exchange. We lay our fears at God's feet and receive His peace, presence, and guidance. When we place our fears in His hands, the impossible becomes possible because we are trusting in the God who sees and hears everything. The secret to overcoming fear doesn't lie in the absence of challenges, but in the constant presence of God, who always responds when we turn to Him in prayer. So, when fear threatens to overwhelm you, remember the power of prayer. No matter how small or great the fear, Jesus invites you to withdraw to the secret place and connect with the Father. There, in the silence and away from the world's gaze, you'll find the strength to face any challenge. The secret to overcoming fear is not found in avoiding problems, but in knowing that God is always present, listening, and responding to your prayers.